Alright, so we started talking about the placenta at the end of the last part. So placenta is formed from the chorion. Just remember that's the embryonic structure that these come from. So they come from the chorion, and those fingers that branch out were called chorionic villi. You can actually see those in this picture at the bottom. What we're looking at here, so the placenta is kind of all of this area right here. So the embryonic blood mixing with the mother's blood. What we're going to do is zoom in on one of these sections in this picture. So the chorionic villi are the finger-like projections. This is coming from the embryo. Those fingers that are branching from the top and going down into that purple, those are coming from the embryo. All of the purple area around there, that is maternal blood. So that's blood that's coming from the mother. The placental membrane is made up of a few different layers. It's the epithelial wall of the embryonic capillary. It's kind of a lot of words, but what that means, embryonic capillary, means that the embryo is going to be somewhere above this picture, and then leaving from the embryo, from the umbilical region, what's eventually going to become the belly button, we have umbilical arteries and umbilical veins. Those are going to branch further and further until we get into these small blood vessels called embryonic capillaries. Let me go ahead and point out, if you'll notice the arteries and veins, the colors are reversed, kind of like what they are with the, when we were going to the lungs, the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. So it's the same idea. Remember, artery means that blood is going away. In this case, since we're talking about the embryo, blood is going away from the embryo. Now, what the placenta is used for, one of the things is it helps the embryo get oxygen. So it's going away from the embryo, but it doesn't have oxygen. So that means that it's an artery, but it's blue. It picks up oxygen at the placenta, and when it comes back, the veins, which go back to the embryo, back to the heart of the embryo, are oxygenated, so they're red. So just kind of remember that. The colors are going to be different. Alright, so placental membrane made up of the epithelial wall of the embryonic capillary, so the walls of the blood vessels of the embryo. It's made up of epithelial wall of the chorionic villus, or villi is plural, that's those finger-like projections. And then it's made up of portions of the maternal uterine wall. So it's got three different layers, and you can kind of see this right here. It's the capillaries. It's got the chorionic villi membrane would be like the outside layer right here. And then the, so there's the wall of the villus. And then on the other side of all this purple, you would have the wall of the mother's uterus. And that's where the blood is going to pool from the mother's blood into this purple section, which is the maternal blood. Alright, so placenta consists of an embryonic portion and a maternal portion. Kind of underline or highlight that. Just make sure you get the big picture. What we're saying is that this is a much better picture to try to understand what the placenta is. So the placenta is this entire region from here all the way down to here. It's made up of at the top is blood vessels from the embryo. So this is embryonic blood. There is the chorionic villi that branch out. Down here, these blood vessels are from the mother, so this is maternal blood vessels. They meet in the middle, where the mother's blood pools in this purple area, and then the capillaries from the embryo branch out through the chorionic villi. And again, what happens is that oxygen from the mother is going to pool up in that tissue, and we call that the lacuna. So oxygen from the mother is going to pool up in the lacuna where the blood forms, and it's going to diffuse into the embryonic capillary. Same thing with nutrients that the mother gets from her food. Those nutrients are going to pool up in that blood, and they're going to diffuse. They're going to go from high concentration from the mother's blood to a lower concentration in the embryo's blood. At the same time, the waste that is building up in the embryo, like usually our kidneys get rid of waste, our digestive system gets rid of waste, our breathing gets rid of carbon dioxide. Now, the embryo is not urinating or breathing or anything like that, so all of the waste has to come from the blood source, from the umbilical arteries. So it's leaving from the embryo, traveling through the umbilical arteries, and then when it gets down to here, to the chorionic villi, it's going to diffuse. All that waste is going to go out into this blood, into the lacuna. And the mother picks up that waste and she removes it. So the big picture, if you're still struggling with the placenta, just the very basic overview of what its function is it allows the mother's blood to send oxygen and nutrients to the embryo, and it allows the embryo to remove waste from its blood, and the mother can pick up that waste and get rid of it using her, fully developed body. All right, so again, just remember that it's actually a shared organ. Part of it is going to be the embryo, part of it is going to be the mother, but it consists of embryonic and maternal portions. And again, we mentioned this earlier, just notice that the umbilical arteries are going to be blue, because even though they're going away from the embryo, that makes them an artery, but they don't have oxygen yet, so they're going to be blue. The veins are red because they are returning blood to the embryo's heart, but they do have oxygen, so that's why they're looking red. All right, so we are developing a little bit further now. It says this is the placenta at the 7th week. And again, one more time, you can see on this side right here, this is blood flow coming from the mother. It's going to travel into, again, this pooled section was called the lacuna. And then the umbilical cord is going to bring the umbilical arteries and veins. Chorionic villi are those fingers that are going to spread out into that pooled blood, and they're going to pick up oxygen and nutrients. They're also going to dump off waste, and when the waste gets dumped from the embryo, it's going to go into that pool of blood, and it's going to get drained from that pool into the mother's blood system, and the mother is going to be able to remove it. All right, so hormonal things that the placenta is doing. It starts to synthesize progesterone. If you'll remember, the outside layer, the trophoblast, was secreting HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, earlier, and that was making the corpus luteum, the outside layer of the follicle after ovulation. It was making that release estrogen and progesterone. But now that is not functioning as much anymore. The corpus luteum is not functioning. It's not releasing those hormones. So the placenta has started releasing hormones. The placenta synthesizes progesterone. The cells of the developing adrenal glands use progesterone to produce estrogen. So the adrenal glands have just started to form, and that progesterone is going to get transformed into estrogen. Estrogen causes changes in the uterus. For the mother, it causes changes in the breast, in the maternal metabolism, and in fetal organ development. So really the big picture right here, what we're saying is that the shift from the hormones, estrogen and progesterone, those are now being produced by the placenta, or due to the placenta. Earlier it was the corpus luteum. So lastly, the last stage of embryo would be at 8 weeks. It says at the end of 8 weeks, this marks the end of the embryonic period, and we change the name to the fetal period after 8 weeks. All right, quick, kind of like a case study right here, is something called teratogens. So a teratogen is a factor, is any chemical that can cause congenital malformations during embryonic development. Very early on, from the last part of the lecture, we saw that there's a lot of systems that are being developed during the first few weeks of embryonic development. So that means that anything that is in the mother's blood system is going to be shared with the embryo's blood system. And some of those chemicals are obviously very harmful. So factors that cause malformations are called, again, that word is teratogens. If you will look at the chart to the right, it shows when different structures are developed. So, for example, the reproductive system is developed, if you look where that bar is, it starts right after the first month, and our reproductive system is not completely developed until the end of the 5th month. So what this means is that there are certain teratogens, there are certain chemicals that if they are somehow introduced into the embryo or into the fetus's blood during this time period, they can cause damage to the developing reproductive system. Same thing with the ears, eyes, upper and lower limbs, and the heart. Those all develop a little bit earlier, and they're done by like the second month. The scary thing about that, though, is those first couple months, I'm sure you've seen the TV shows where it was like, I didn't know I was pregnant, and people have a child and they didn't know they were pregnant. So it's not that uncommon that you could be a couple months pregnant and you don't even know. Sometimes there is even some bleeding that'll occur with implantation. The woman will think that that's a menstrual flow, so she thinks that she's not pregnant. So those early stages of development, you might not be aware that you're pregnant, but there's definitely damage that can occur to the embryo if there are certain chemicals in the mother's blood. So that's why you have to be really careful. The general rule of thumb, or the advice that is given by health professionals, is that if you are not actively trying to prevent a pregnancy, you need to stay away from any potential teratogens. So the main ones that we think of are going to be smoke, like cigarettes, alcohol, and things like that. But there are certain these are all different medications. So Accutane was an acne medication, and it actually caused facial deformity. So there's a big push. I think they've kind of shifted away from Accutane now, but there was a big push once they learned that if you were on Accutane and you were a female and there was a chance that you could get pregnant, you needed to be on birth control because that can cause some really serious side effects. You can see that Accutane, if it's in the mother's system for the first 3 months of pregnancy, there's some pretty significant effects that can occur. Central nervous system, if you look at that, it starts to develop just a couple weeks in. So middle of the first month of pregnancy, all the way throughout the entire term of the pregnancy. So central nervous system could be affected by teratogens throughout the entire length of the pregnancy. That's why smoking and alcohol are definitely not okay if you're pregnant, because that can affect the central nervous system of the embryo and then later the fetus. So that's kind of what this says down at the bottom. Structures in the developing embryo are sensitive to teratogens at different times. Okay, and this shows fetal stages. This is just showing us that fetal, first off, at the end of the 8th week, that's when we shift over into fetal development. Weeks 1 through 8, we called it embryonic development, so the developing offspring would be referred to as the embryo. At 8 weeks until the end of the pregnancy, the anatomy term that we use is the fetus. And during this time, body portions are changing really, really rapidly. So this is kind of a funny picture, but if you look at it, start with the left side. Says the 2-month embryo. So that means right here would be the very end of embryonic development. This is where we're about to switch over from embryo into fetus. If you look at the head, it is huge. It's 50% of the height of the embryo is their head. It looks kind of like a college mascot to me, just this big, massive head. Is the embryo. When we go 1 month later into the fetus, we can see that the proportion of the head is starting to shrink. So instead of 50%, it's like 37% of the length of the fetus. By the time you're a newborn, your head's about 25% of your length, and then by the time you get down to adulthood, like 22 years or so, it's maybe 10 or 12%. So the proportions change considerably during fetal development, and then really throughout your whole life, the proportions continue to change. So quick note I would add right here, just really, really short. You can say as we age, or say as we develop. As we develop, head gets smaller. Well, let me reword that, because your head does not get smaller. Your head gets proportionately smaller. That means it makes up a smaller percentage of your overall body length. So head gets proportionately smaller. And then we can say that the limbs get proportionately larger. So head gets proportionately smaller, limbs get proportionately larger. All right, so there's a good break spot for this. We will pick up and look at a little bit more about development, and we'll start looking at blood flow in the next section too.